Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly wild concept, how modern adversaries are literally weaponizing the very words of a treaty written way back in 1949. We're talking about the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO's founding document, and we're going to explore a massive, intentional blind spot that's hiding in plain sight. Seriously, if you want to understand the future of global security, you've got to look closely at the exact wording of this document.
To really wrap our heads around this, we need to start with a completely wild week in August of 2026. Things moved incredibly fast here. On August 7th, a Russian man was detained in Warsaw. Then, on August 13th, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk announces they've thwarted a plot to assassinate a dual US-Ukrainian citizen. And then, literally just one day later, a drone gets shot down over Latvia. Now, no one was actually harmed in the Warsaw incident, and the suspect is only accused at this point, but put together, these events severely tested the absolute limits of European security.
So you have the loud version of the Warsaw story, the foiled plot that grabbed all the major headlines. But the quiet version, the one that's going to matter for years to come, it's actually a massive legal blind spot. Because you see, the NATO treaty doesn't use the word plot. It relies on highly specific legal terminology. And right now, nobody in the alliance can tell you with absolute confidence whether what Polish prosecutors allege happened in Warsaw actually crosses the line laid out in that treaty.
This beautifully illustrates the core issue we're looking at today. It's the gap between two key articles in the treaty. On one side, you have Article 4. This is a relatively low bar. If a member feels threatened, they invoke Article 4, and it basically just triggers a meeting to consult. On the other side is the famous Article 5. This is the one that triggers collective defense. The whole "an attack on one is an attack on all" principle. But here's the catch. Article 5 requires an actual literal armed attack. And this is where things get really fascinating. Actions like sabotage, arson, GPS jamming, using recruited proxies, flying unmarked drones, none of this is accidental. These tactics are deliberately engineered to land right in that undefined gap between those two treaty articles. They're definitely more serious than a simple threat that just warrants a meeting, right? But they don't quite look like a traditional armed attack with soldiers and tanks that would trigger a full-blown alliance response. The gap itself is literally the strategy.
This brings us to Section 1, Proxies over Officers, and the Architecture of Deniability.
Let's look at the exact tactic Polish officials allege was used in Warsaw, using a recruited civilian proxy instead of a deployed intelligence officer with a direct chain of command. Think about why this distinction matters so much. It creates this built-in deniability. That asymmetry is the whole point of the tradecraft. To a national legal system, a recruited civilian is just a standard defendant. It's a domestic police matter prosecuted as a simple crime. The legal machinery works fine, but it stops dead at the national border. To an alliance like NATO, though, a recruited civilian is a total dead end. It fails to provide that undeniable direct thread back to a foreign state that an alliance absolutely needs in order to take collective action.
The crucial point here is that a hybrid campaign is built precisely to cause damage while completely withholding the verifiable attribution that a treaty strictly requires. A domestic court needs exhibits, fingerprints, text messages, a physical weapon. But an alliance needs absolute public attribution. It needs to be able to point a finger at a specific foreign government and say, "You did this." If the provocation is literally designed to deny proof, the alliance is effectively paralyzed.
And remember, NATO is a consensus machine made up of 32 different members. That means any formal finding of an armed attack isn't just some technical determination made by a couple of lawyers in a room. It's a monumental political act. That one decision has to satisfy 32 different parliaments. It has to navigate 32 different election calendars, sets of energy contracts, and wildly different risk appetites. The standard for evidence isn't fixed at all. It's whatever the single most reluctant member of those 32 requires it to be.
To be perfectly objective here, while Moscow hasn't specifically responded to the Warsaw Plot allegation, this quote from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov really reflects their broader stance on European allegations. When asked about other reported intentions in Europe, he stated that a great many horror stories are being published about the Russian Federation. Russian officials have also publicly accused Ukraine of preparing provocations. This is a deliberate denial tactic, and it's incredibly effective because it doesn't even need to be fully believed to work. It only needs to successfully make consensus among those 32 NATO members that much harder to achieve.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2. Aluminum and algorithms are what we can call the hardware loophole.
We've talked about human proxies, but this gray zone logic applies to technology and metal just as effectively.
For instance, Poland has specifically warned about adversaries using captured Ukrainian drones to stage false flag attacks. Think about the legal headache that creates. If a drone crosses a border, the very first question a defense alliance asks isn't how do we respond militarily. Instead, it immediately becomes this endless, messy dispute over whose drone was it. If the airframe was actually manufactured in Ukraine, attribution instantly stops being a matter of immediate defense and becomes a complex legal dispute.
And guys, this isn't just hypothetical. Just look at this sequence of events from Latvia. In late June of 2026, intelligence reportedly detected preparations for hybrid activities specifically designed to stay below the threshold of open war. Then, fast forward to August 14th, a drone actually enters Latvian airspace, and NATO jets on Baltic air policing duty actively shoot it down.
But what's truly revealing here is how the whole incident was officially classified. Even with a NATO jet actually firing on a drone, the official explanation from the Latvian military carefully blamed Russian electronic warfare for pushing the drone off course. They officially called it interference, not an attack. That specific wording is incredibly deliberate. It's designed to keep the incident safely below the threshold of open war, totally avoiding the pressure to invoke Article 5.
Let's move on to Section 3, below the threshold, and the options currently left on the shelf.
So, if adversaries are carefully reading the treaty to stay perfectly below that armed attack threshold, what tools does the alliance actually have left? When you can't push the big Article 5 button, you essentially have 4 options, and honestly, they're all pretty unsatisfying. Option 1, prosecute a single defendant in domestic court, which binds one person but ignores the state behind them. Option 2, expel diplomats. But that's a finite resource. You eventually run out of people to kick out. Option 3, hold an Article 4 consultation, which honestly rarely deters anyone. Or Option 4, simply harden your defenses, buying more air defense and counterintelligence.
Now, why this matters so much to us and to the citizens of these countries is the brutal arithmetic of hybrid warfare. If hardening defenses is your most practical remaining option, notice who ends up paying for it. The defending nation quietly absorbs the massive financial cost of every single provocation. The cheap side of this equation is the adversary making the attempts. The incredibly expensive side is the alliance constantly trying to build higher and higher walls.
For some much-needed context here, Article 5 has only been invoked exactly one time in the entire history of the alliance. Just once. That was after the September 11th attacks in 2001. That precedent is fascinating because it proves an armed attack doesn't strictly need to come from a uniformed state army. However, it absolutely requires 2 things that these modern gray zone tactics intentionally lack: massive, undeniable scale and absolute, undisputed attribution.
This brings us to our final section, Section 4, deliberate ambiguity, and the question of where exactly the line is.
This is a reality that completely unsettles international lawyers. If you look at the treaty itself, there is literally no published objective definition of what actually crosses the line into an armed attack. There's no handy checklist or schedule of severities. The threshold for war is a political decision made in the moment under intense pressure. It's not a measurable scientific fact. Now, deliberate ambiguity can be a powerful deterrent. If you don't know exactly where the line is, you might be scared to step too close. But that ambiguity only works if the adversary actually believes the alliance might strike back. Otherwise, every single unpunished incident, every drone blamed on a navigation error, just proves to everyone watching that the line can safely be pushed a little further.
So, moving forward, what should you actually take away from all this? Well, strip away the official press briefings and watch for 3 verifiable things. First, watch if the Warsaw case reaches an actual trial verdict, because a courtroom verdict is hard evidence, whereas an intelligence briefing is just an assertion. Second, watch for formal Article 4 requests from allies over these specific kinds of hybrid incidents. And finally, keep an eye out to see if NATO ever attempts to finally write down the rules and officially define that threshold. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. An alliance that was built in 1949 to stop massive columns of tanks is now facing algorithms, captured drones, and recruited civilian proxies. So when exactly does a domestic crime become an act of war? And if NATO finally does decide to write down exactly where that line is, will it actually deter future attacks? Or will it just hand adversaries a highly detailed map of exactly how close they can safely get?